The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the fields with a golden glow. Jeremiah Turner, a 45-year-old black farmer, stood at the edge of his property, his calloused hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the land he had spent a lifetime nurturing. He was tall, with broad shoulders that carried not just the weight of his work, but also the legacy of generations before him. His face, weathered by years under the sun, was framed by a graying beard that he often scratched when deep in thought. Despite the challenges he faced as a black man in a predominantly white farming community, Jeremiah exuded a quiet confidence and kindness that earned him respect from some and resentment from others. Jeremiah's life revolved around his family and his farm. He was a man of principles, someone who believed in the value of hard work, integrity, and, above all, treating others with kindness, even when it wasn't returned. But beneath his calm demeanor lay a subtle but persistent insecurity, a nagging feeling that no matter how hard he worked or how good a person he was, there were those who would always see him as an outsider. For Jeremiah, farming wasn't just a livelihood. It was his way of connecting with his ancestors. His great-grandfather had tilled this very soil as a sharecropper, and now Jeremiah owned it outright, a triumph he didn't take lightly. Every morning, Jeremiah rose before dawn, the alarm clock on his bedside table barely needed. He slipped on his worn boots, patched over years of wear, and headed outside to start his day. The first stop was always the barn, where his two trusty horses and a handful of cows waited patiently for their morning feed. The rhythmic sound of grain spilling into troughs was accompanied by soft nickers and the occasional clanging of metal buckets. After the animals were cared for, Jeremiah moved on to his fields. Rows of corn and soybeans stretched as far as the eye could see, the green leaves shimmering with dew in the early light. He loved the solitude of these moments, the peaceful hum of nature around him, and the satisfaction of knowing his hard work would soon bear fruit, literally. By midday, Jeremiah would return to the farmhouse, where his wife, Linda, always had lunch waiting. Their teenage son, Marcus, often joined them, sharing stories about school or basketball practice. These meals were Jeremiah's anchor, a reminder of why he worked so hard. The afternoons were spent mending fences, repairing equipment, or driving into town for supplies. While most of the townsfolk greeted him warmly, there were always a few cold stares and whispered comments. Jeremiah didn't let it show, but he noticed. The Turner farm was a place of beauty and resilience. The main farmhouse, painted a soft shade of white, stood proudly atop a small hill. Its wraparound porch, adorned with a swing and potted flowers, was Linda's pride and joy. Behind the house, a red barn loomed large, its roof slightly rusted but still sturdy. The smell of hay mixed with the earthy scent of soil created an atmosphere that felt alive, rooted in history and hard work. The fields were the heart of the farm, stretching out in neat rows that reflected Jeremiah's meticulous nature. Beyond the crops lay a small pond, its surface often dotted with ducks and dragonflies. A towering oak tree stood nearby, its branches providing shade for Jeremiah's occasional moments of rest. The town of Ridgefield was a 15-minute drive from the farm, a quaint community where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. The general store, church, and diner were the main gathering spots, and while many people were friendly enough, there was an undercurrent of tension that lingered beneath the surface. One neighbor in particular stood out, Earl Peterson, an older man whose property bordered the Turner farm. Earl had lived in Ridgefield his entire life and made it no secret that he disapproved of Jeremiah's success. Should have stayed a sharecropper, Earl had muttered once, loud enough for Jeremiah to hear. Jeremiah had learned to ignore men like Earl, but the tension was impossible to deny. Earl rarely ventured past the weathered wooden fence that divided their properties, and when he did, it was usually to complain. Whether it was about stray livestock, overgrown hedges, or imagined grievances, Earl seemed to find any excuse to remind Jeremiah of his disapproval. But despite Earl's hostility, Jeremiah couldn't bring himself to hold a grudge. A man's actions are a reflection of his heart, Linda often reminded him. Still, there were moments when Jeremiah wondered if he was too forgiving. Unbeknownst to Jeremiah, this fragile peace was about to be shattered. A storm was brewing, both in the skies and in his life. and it would force him to confront not just Earl, but his own beliefs about forgiveness, justice, and the true meaning of community. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when the storm clouds began rolling in. Jeremiah was in the middle of inspecting his soybean crop when he noticed the change in the air, a sudden stillness that signaled the arrival of something fierce. He glanced at the horizon, where dark clouds gathered like an army preparing for battle. "Looks like a big one," he murmured, wiping sweat from his brow and heading back toward the barn to secure the tools. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Jeremiah noticed something unusual on the far side of his property. Thick black smoke curled into the air, and the faint orange glow of flames flickered through the trees. His heart skipped a beat. That was Earl Peterson's barn. Without a second thought, Jeremiah jumped into his truck and sped down the dirt road toward Earl's property. The closer he got, the more intense the smoke became, stinging his eyes and filling his lungs. When he arrived, chaos greeted him. Earl was frantically trying to pull a horse out of the barn, coughing and shouting in panic. The flames were spreading fast, licking at the wooden structure with a ferocity that threatened to consume everything. "Earl," Jeremiah called out, leaping out of his truck. "Get back. You'll get yourself killed." Earl turned, his face a mask of soot and desperation. "I can't let it burn. I've got equipment in there. Priceless stuff." Jeremiah didn't hesitate. He grabbed a tarp from the truck bed, soaked it with water from the horse trough, and wrapped it around himself. "Stay here," he ordered, before plunging into the barn to help. Inside the barn, the heat was unbearable. Smoke filled Jeremiah's lungs as he stumbled through the thick haze, searching for anything he could salvage. The panicked neighing of a horse guided him to the far stall, where a terrified mare pawed at the ground. "It's okay, girl," he said soothingly, his voice cracking from the smoke. He quickly unlatched the gate and led the horse out, shielding her from falling embers as they made their way outside. When he emerged, leading the horse to safety, Earl was waiting, his expression a mix of relief and resentment. "Why'd you come here?" he demanded, his voice rough. "This ain't your problem." Jeremiah paused, catching his breath. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied simply, brushing soot from his hands. Earl didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He averted his gaze as Jeremiah turned back toward the burning barn, determined to save whatever he could before it was too late. By the time the fire department arrived, the barn was little more than a smoldering pile of ash. Jeremiah stayed to help douse the remaining embers, ignoring the growing ache in his muscles and the sting of soot in his eyes. It wasn't until nightfall that he finally returned to his own farm, exhausted and covered in grime. Linda met him at the door, worry etched into her features. "What happened?" she asked, handing him a damp towel. "Earl's barn caught fire," Jeremiah replied, sinking into a chair. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." Linda frowned. "And did he thank you?" Jeremiah hesitated. "Not exactly," he admitted, recalling the coldness in Earl's gaze even as he'd worked to save what little remained of the barn. The next morning, Jeremiah's routine was disrupted as he found himself thinking about the fire and Earl's reaction. There was something off about the whole situation. Why hadn't Earl called for help sooner? Why had he been so determined to save the barn, even at the risk of his own life? As Jeremiah worked his fields, these questions lingered in the back of his mind. Something about the fire didn't add up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than Earl was letting on. The aftermath of the fire quickly became the talk of Ridgefield. At the diner, in the general store, and even at church, whispers spread about what had happened. Some called it an accident, blaming the lightning storm that had swept through the area. Others speculated it might have been negligence or something more sinister. Jeremiah tried to focus on his own work, but the questions wouldn't stop nagging at him. He couldn't forget Earl's frantic behavior that night, the desperation in his voice, the strange urgency to save priceless equipment. What kind of equipment? Earl never struck Jeremiah as the type to own anything of real value, at least not enough to risk his life for. A few days later, Jeremiah decided to pay Earl a visit. He found him sitting on the porch of his modest house, nursing a bottle of whiskey. Earl barely looked up as Jeremiah approached. "Thought I'd check in," Jeremiah said, his tone careful but firm. You holding up okay? Earl grunted. Barn's gone. What do you think? Jeremiah glanced at the charred remains of the barn, now reduced to rubble. Insurance should cover some of the damages, he offered. Earl's laugh was sharp and bitter. Insurance? You think those folks are going to help me out? They've been looking for a reason to cut me loose for years. The bitterness in Earl's voice hinted at a deeper frustration, one Jeremiah couldn't ignore. But before he could press further, Earl waved him off. I don't need your pity. Go tend to your own farm. Jeremiah left, but the encounter only deepened his curiosity. Something wasn't right, and he was determined to figure out what Earl was hiding. The fire and Jeremiah's involvement became a topic of conversation among the townspeople, and reactions varied. At the church social, Reverend Carter pulled Jeremiah aside. You did a good thing, helping Earl, he said, his voice kind but measured. Not everyone would have done the same. Jeremiah shrugged. It was the right thing to do. But not everyone sees it that way, the Reverend added, his eyes scanning the room. Jeremiah followed his gaze and noticed a few familiar faces whispering in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward him. They think I'm sticking my nose where it doesn't belong, Jeremiah guessed. Reverend Carter sighed. Some people don't like change, Jeremiah, and they don't like being reminded of their own shortcomings. Meanwhile, Linda remained Jeremiah's biggest supporter, though even she was skeptical about Earl's gratitude. You've done more for that man than he deserves, she said one evening as they sat on the porch. Don't let him drag you into his mess. Marcus, their teenage son, chimed in. Why do you even care what happens to him? He's been nothing but a jerk. Jeremiah thought for a moment before replying. Because sometimes the people who need kindness the most are the ones who deserve it the least. Despite his outward resolve, Jeremiah couldn't shake the doubts that gnawed at him. Why had he risked so much to help a man who wouldn't have done the same for him? Was it really about doing the right thing? Or was he trying to prove something? To Earl, to the town, or maybe even to himself? Late at night, when the rest of the house was asleep, Jeremiah would sit by the window, staring out at the stars. The land he'd worked so hard to claim as his own now felt heavy, burdened by the weight of unspoken questions. He replayed the events of the fire in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed. Earl's frantic words echoed in his memory. Priceless stuff. What could he have meant? Jeremiah knew Earl wasn't wealthy. His farm barely scraped by most seasons. The thought troubled Jeremiah more than he cared to admit. He wanted to believe that his kindness hadn't been in vain, but the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if Earl's hostility wasn't just about race but something deeper. One evening, as Jeremiah walked the fence line, he found himself staring at the charred remains of Earl's barn in the distance. The sight stirred something in him, a mix of anger and sadness. He hated that Earl had treated him poorly for years, but he also couldn't ignore the man's pain. Linda's words replayed in his mind. Don't let him drag you into his mess. But Jeremiah couldn't shake the feeling that the mess was already part of him. He had stepped into it the moment he decided to help. The question was, how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? Jeremiah's growing frustration reached a boiling point when he overheard a conversation at the general store. Two men were talking in hushed tones, their words carrying just enough for Jeremiah to catch snippets. Earl's barn wasn't just a barn, you know. Yeah, but if people found out, doesn't matter now. It's gone. Jeremiah's heart raced. What were they talking about? Was there something hidden in that barn? Something Earl had been protecting at all costs? That night, Jeremiah couldn't sleep. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of a revelation that could change everything. The truth about Earl, the fire, and their years of tension was within reach. But he knew that once he uncovered it, there would be no going back. Jeremiah's curiosity finally got the better of him. One evening, after finishing his work on the farm, he decided to revisit Earl's property. The charred remains of the barn stood like a grave marker, shrouded in darkness under the light of the crescent moon. Jeremiah parked his truck a short distance away and walked the rest of the way, careful to stay out of sight. He knew Earl wouldn't take kindly to his presence, but something in his gut told him there was more to this story. As he approached the ruins, the faint smell of smoke still lingered in the air. He stepped cautiously, his boots crunching on the burnt debris. Then he saw it. Amid the ashes, something metallic glinted faintly under the moonlight. Jeremiah knelt down and brushed away the soot, revealing a heavy, rusted padlock attached to what appeared to be a small, half-buried trapdoor. "What were you hiding, Earl?" Jeremiah murmured to himself. Using a crowbar he'd brought along just in case, Jeremiah pried the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound cutting through the still night. Beneath it was a hidden compartment filled with old crates. He opened one, his breath catching as he pulled out stacks of cash wrapped in plastic. Beside them lay papers, ledgers filled with numbers, names, and transactions. Jeremiah's stomach turned as the realization hit him. Earl's barn wasn't just a barn. It was a front for something illegal. The ledgers told the story. Earl had been running a smuggling operation for years. The next morning, Jeremiah confronted Earl. He found him sitting on his porch, the same bottle of whiskey from before now nearly empty. Earl didn't even flinch when Jeremiah approached, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "You've got some explaining to do," Jeremiah said, dropping the ledgers onto the table. Earl's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, reaching for the papers, but Jeremiah slapped his hand away. "I know enough," Jeremiah shot back. "I know you've been running something shady out of that barn for years. And I know that fire wasn't just an accident, was it?" Earl slumped in his chair, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the truth had finally crushed him. "You think you're better than me?" he spat bitterly. "You don't know what it's like, trying to survive in a world that don't give a damn about you." Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know struggle? You think I haven't had to fight for everything I've got?" He leaned in closer. "The difference is, I didn't take shortcuts. I didn't cheat people to get there." Earl looked away, his face crumpling. "I didn't have a choice," he mumbled. "Everyone has a choice," Jeremiah said firmly. "Even now, you've got one." Earl's eyes flicked back to Jeremiah, a mixture of fear and defiance. "What are you gonna do? Turn me in?" The weight of Earl's words hung in the air. Jeremiah's mind raced with the implications of what he'd discovered. If he reported Earl, it would destroy the man's life, what little was left of it. But if he stayed silent, he'd be complicit in hiding the truth. "I don't know," Jeremiah admitted, his voice heavy, "but I do know one thing. You've got to stop running from your mistakes." Earl laughed bitterly. "You think that'll fix anything? You think people like me get second chances?" Jeremiah crossed his arms, his expression stern. "It's not about what other people think. It's about doing what's right. You've spent your whole life blaming others for your problems. But this is on you, Earl. And it's time you owned up to it." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Finally, Earl nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Fine," he said quietly. "I'll handle it." Jeremiah didn't know if he believed him, but he decided to leave it at that, for now. As he walked away, he felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and oddly, hope. Maybe, just maybe, Earl could change. But Jeremiah also knew he couldn't just leave things to chance. He resolved to keep an eye on Earl and make sure he didn't drag anyone else into his mess. The days following Jeremiah's confrontation with Earl were marked by tension and uncertainty. True to his word, Earl began taking small steps to clean up the mess he had made. The first came when he approached the sheriff's office to confess. Word quickly spread that Earl was cooperating with authorities, revealing details about the smuggling operation he'd been running. Jeremiah watched from a distance, unsure of what to make of Earl's sudden change of heart. Part of him wanted to believe that the man could redeem himself, but another part wondered if Earl was just trying to save his own skin. One evening, as Jeremiah was finishing up his chores, he saw Earl walking up the dirt road that separated their properties. Earl's posture was hunched, his hat clutched nervously in his hands. "What brings you here?" Jeremiah asked, wiping his hands on his jeans. Earl hesitated before replying. "I came to say thank you for pulling me out of that fire, literally and figuratively." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. "You didn't seem too grateful at the time." Earl chuckled dryly. "Yeah, well, I've had some time to think. You were right. I've been blaming everyone but myself. I'm trying to fix that now." Though Jeremiah remained guarded, he nodded. "It's a start." True to his word, Earl made visible efforts to turn his life around. He sold off the remaining land he owned, using the proceeds to pay back some of the people he had wronged. He also began volunteering at the local community center, working with troubled youth who reminded him of himself. Jeremiah watched these developments with a mixture of skepticism and cautious optimism. The townspeople were slower to forgive, but as weeks turned into months, Earl's actions began to speak louder than his past mistakes. For Jeremiah, seeing Earl's transformation was a reminder of the power of second chances. It wasn't easy to let go of the resentment he had carried for years, but he found himself learning to forgive, not for Earl's sake, but for his own peace of mind. Meanwhile, Jeremiah's own farm began to flourish. The act of stepping in during Earl's crisis had drawn attention to his quiet acts of kindness, and people in the community started seeing him in a new light. One day, Earl stopped by with a small box. "I found this in the rubble of the barn," he said, handing it to Jeremiah. Inside was a collection of old photographs, snapshots of Earl's family and farm, taken long before things had gone south. "I think it's time to let go of the past," Earl said quietly. Jeremiah smiled. "Maybe it is." Sitting on his porch that evening, Jeremiah reflected on everything that had happened. The fire, the secrets, the confrontation. All of it had tested his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. But through it all, he had stayed true to himself, choosing kindness and integrity over bitterness and revenge. He thought about Earl, a man he had once written off as irredeemable. While their relationship might never be one of friendship, there was now a fragile truce between them. A shared understanding that people are capable of change, no matter how far they've fallen. Jeremiah glanced at the horizon, where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold. The sight filled him with a sense of peace. Life on the farm would go on, as it always did. But he knew he would carry the lessons of this experience with him. Sometimes he murmured to himself, "The hardest thing isn't fighting the fire. It's finding the courage to rebuild after it's gone." As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Jeremiah stepped off the porch and walked down to the edge of his property, where a single oak tree stood tall and proud. It was the same tree his grandfather had planted decades ago, a symbol of resilience and strength. He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the photographs Earl had given him, a picture of the barn in its prime, surrounded by golden fields. With a small smile, Jeremiah folded the photo and placed it at the base of the tree. It wasn't an act of sentimentality, but a gesture of closure. The past was behind him now, and the future stretched ahead, filled with endless possibilities. As he turned to head back home, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak tree. For the first time in a long while, Jeremiah felt light, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew one thing for certain. No matter how difficult the journey, the choices he made would always be guided by what was right. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, redemption, and the power of doing what's right. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Jeremiah's place?